It's about +4. Yes, you're right, this is not my parlour guitar. This is my workshop guitar. This is my junk guitar for doing stuff to, and I don't care what happens to it. Who knows, one day maybe I'll burn this guitar. But I'm going to explain intonation, and I'm going to use this guitar to explain setting the intonation. But first, and I apologise for this, a little bit of mathematics. Stay with me. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll come back to the answer later. What is 1 plus a half plus a quarter plus an eighth plus a 16th plus a 32nd plus a 64th, and so on and so on and so on? It has a very definite answer. So have a think about that and you'll see why this is important later on. But first, let's have a look at this guitar, and I'll talk about scale length and why we need an intonation compensation. Come here. This is a Fender style instrument, and so we know already that it's a scale length of 25.5 inches or 648 millimeters. But if we want to measure that, we put a straight edge up against the nut. Okay, I say a straight edge, a ruler, and we measure to the 12th fret, and we can see that it's 324 millimeters. Now, if we consider what's going on at the bridge, we can see that the saddles are all adjusted back slightly, so that our imaginary 648, let's call it the scale length point, the point of zero intonation, the 648 millimeter point, lies just in front of the saddles, fractionally in the case of this string, and by maybe 2 millimeters for the bass string. So what's going on? If all those saddles were adjusted so that they were spot on the 648 millimeter scale length, then the guitar would play out of tune. And this is for one of two reasons. First of all, just the action of fretting the note bends the string slightly and just sharpens the note a little bit. But there's another effect going on, which has a greater effect really on the pitch of the string. And that is that when the string is vibrating, because of the stiffness of the string isn't free to pivot over the nut and over the bridge. And the effective vibrating length of the string is a small amount less than the length between the nut and the saddle. Now this effect is very slight on the thin E string, but as the strings get thicker, they get stiffer, and so the null point, the node where the string isn't vibrating, the end of the string is the node, but actually the actual virtual null point, if you like, is slightly in front of the bridge because of this inherent stiffness in the string. And so we need to have each string just a little bit longer than what the scale length would indicate. And the thicker the string, the more we have to lengthen it. So for the bass string on electric guitar, that may be as much as 3 millimeters. For the treble string, it may be very little at all. It might just be 1 millimeter, maybe slightly less. So what you see on a properly intonated guitar is the thicker the string, the further back the saddle needs to be. And you'll usually see a pattern where there's a jump between the solid strings and the wound strings. So the solid strings go further back, but then the first of the wound strings is further forward than the thickest of the solid strings. And that's because this slightly thicker solid string has a thicker core than the wound string next to it, and the wound string is actually a little bit more flexible than the solid, in this case the G string. So it doesn't need quite so much intonation compensation. But then we're back to the same old pattern. As the thicker the string gets, the stiffer it gets, and we have more and more compensation. And on an acoustic guitar, where only the top two are solid and the rest are wound, you'll usually find the G intonation point is further forward. That's if the acoustic guitar has intonation compensation built into the saddle, because on an acoustic guitar you'll usually find the entire saddle is tilted, and it's usually 3mm different between the top and the bottom. Now on some guitars the saddle is just straight and the compensation is added gradually to each string. But on some guitars, the way the saddle is crowned, you'll see a small step in the saddle. So the crown point, the top, the pointed bit of the saddle, I'm explaining this really badly, is further back for the B string than it is for the D string. So I guess, why don't I go and get a modern acoustic guitar and I'll show you what that looks like. Here is our modern acoustic guitar, and you will see two things: that the saddle is sloped back towards the bass side, so it's 3mm further back over here. Can I show you that? Than over here. So we've got intonation compensation going on there. But more than that, the crown on the saddle is towards the back of the saddle for the bass string here, for the E string. It's a little bit further forward here, a little bit further forward here, and it's right at the front of the saddle for the G string. But then on the B string, it's all the way back again, and on the E string, it's right in the middle. So we have a sort of a global intonation slope across the whole thing of 3mm between top and bottom. But then we have a sort of micro adjustment, string by string, just as we would have on an electric guitar, except we know that this string is usually going to be wound, and so we have one slope here for the wound strings and a different slope here for the solid strings. So now let's go and get my dorso out. Here's my dorso, and this has a scale length of 629mm. So 629 on the treble string is right at the front of the saddle. We've got 630 in the middle. I hope you can see that. And for the bass string, we have 631 at the front of the saddle, 631 and a half, and we've got 634 at the back of the saddle. The saddle's 2.5mm wide, so we've got 2.5mm of micro adjustment, and we've got about a 2.5mm slope on the whole saddle. So now we've got to think about how we add the micro adjustment. Now this is a vintage guitar. I could just crown it in the middle and be done with it, and that would be very close to exactly right. And on a vintage guitar, I very much doubt whether there would have been this micro adjustment. But let's try to get this as accurate as we can. Incidentally, I should add that this is a little bit of a fix. The bridge originally would have been much straighter. There wouldn't have been this big slope on it, because it would have been gut strings. Gut strings are softer and they don't need so much intonation compensation. So there would have been barely any. It would probably have been just a perpendicular saddle positioned somewhere about there, and we wouldn't have had this slope on it. So this is a little bit of a cheat. This isn't really authentic. And I think having micro adjustment on a saddle isn't really authentic either, because on a vintage guitar, I've never seen micro adjustment like that on old guitars. On modern classical guitars with a perpendicular bridge, you do get a little bit of compensation built into the saddle. But 120 years ago, I very much doubt it. So I could just crown this in the middle and be done with it. That's one option. I could put the same adjustment in that you've just seen on my modern James Nelligan guitar, in that I could put a crown sloping back across the saddle here, and then a separate crown sloping back across the top two strings. That would be another way of doing it, and just hope that it's accurate enough. Or I can try and bring mathematics to bear and work out exactly where the crown is supposed to be. So, back to our mathematics. So let's have a think about how we would normally set the intonation on an electric guitar. You get the string tuned to the correct pitch. You then fret the note, check the pitch against your tuner, see whether it's sharp or flat. It will often be sharp, and then you move the saddle back to flatten that note off until the 12th fret is exactly an octave above the open string. You can use harmonics and if your ear is good enough, you can tune by ear, can set the intonation by ear, but today we have electronic tuners. Why not use one of those? On an acoustic guitar, we can't do this micro adjustment, because once we've set the crown on the saddle, to then move that forward or back, we can only do that by lowering the saddle at that point. So we need to get the crown set right first time. So we need to know, given, say we fret there and we find out that that is 3 cents sharp, we need to know how much to move the crown back, given that it's 3 cents. And intuitively, if it was only 2 cents sharp, one would imagine you'd only move back 2/3 of whatever that magic distance was for 3 cents. There must be a figure there must be a formula that says if it's 1 cent sharp, move back so many millimeters, if it's 2 cents, move back, and so on. So how can we work that out? Right, bear with me. What is a cent? A cent is 100th of a semitone, just as the name implies. It's a cent, it's 100th. Now that's on a logarithmic scale. In my previous video, I think 2 videos ago, I was talking about string tension, and I was talking about how the frequency changes every time you fret a note, and I talked about the 12th root of 2 being the ratio of 2 notes. And I know I've probably lost some of you already, but just as the neck is divided up into 12 logarithmically to go up the octave, it's divided into 1200 if we're going up 1 cent at a time. So you can almost imagine like there's 1200 frets on the guitar, 100 extra frets between each semitone, all the way up the neck, and they're a distance apart down here, and they're half that distance apart up here. And we can work out that distance. Just as we can work out where the frets are supposed to be, we can work out where these cent frets are supposed to be. Do you follow me? And it's done logarithmically. But given that we know that the distance between the 11th and the 12th fret, and I'm doing this as we go, I've got no idea, but it looks to be about 19 millimeters on this guitar. So you could imagine that 1 cent must be about 0.19 of a millimeter. Okay? With me? That's an approximation because it has to be a logarithmic calculation. But what that tends to show is that if we want to flatten the note by 1 cent, we need to lengthen the string by 0.19 of a millimeter. Okay, so that's it then. We've got our formula. 1 cent, 0.19 of a millimetre, or if we measure between these two frets, 0.18. If we measure between the 12th and the 13th, because it's smaller, it's logarithmic, it's getting smaller as we go up the neck. So that's the end of the story then. No, it isn't. It's actually double that. And this is where we come back to my question at the beginning of the video. What's 1 plus a half plus a quarter plus an eighth? The answer to that question is it's 2. We take 1, we add a half, we get 1 and a half. We add a quarter, we get 1 and 3/4. We add an eighth, we add 1 and 7/8. We add a 16th, we have 1 and 15/16. Then we get 1 and 31/32, 1 and 63/64. And it's getting closer and closer and closer to 2. In fact, it is 2. The adjustment we need to make, and let's take 18 millimeters as our example. The adjustment we need to make is 0.36 of a millimetre for every 1 cent that we're sharp. If we're sharp by 1 cent, we need to move the saddle back, or the crown of the saddle. We need to move the crown of the saddle back by 0.36 of a millimetre. So that's roughly 1 millimetre for every 3 cents. Okay? So why is it double? Okay, I'm going to get my electric guitar out again and I'll try and explain why. This is a 1959 Gibson Les Paul. And I'm using this rather than the jug guitar because on this we stand a better chance of being able to move the saddle backwards and forwards without affecting the tension in the string. In practice, there will be a change in tension, but not nearly as much as on a Stratocaster, and the bridge is fixed. On a Stratocaster, there's all sorts of things happening with the tremolo, with the bridge moving as you change the action, and all sorts of things like that. So we're going to do a little thought experiment. We're going to imagine that we haven't yet set the intonation on this, and that all the saddles are set. Let's say they're set at the scale length. So we tune the guitar and we fret the octave. We see on our tuner that it's 1 cent sharp, and we know from our calculation, this is the same scale length as my dorso, which is another reason I'm using it. We know from our little calculation that 1 cent corresponds to about 0.18 of a millimetre. So good, let's adjust the saddle and let's move it back 0.18 of a millimetre so that the octave is now tuned exactly to E. So we've done that, we check on our tuner, lo and behold, our calculation was correct. That is now tuned to E. Brilliant. But when we fret the open string, what we now find is it's a little bit flat because we've lengthened the whole string. And we're assuming here that the tension in the string is constant throughout this, which in practice it won't be, but this is a thought experiment. Let's imagine that the tension is constant. The pitch of the open string has now dropped, so we might be in tune at the octave, but we're flat on the open string. In other words, we're still sharp at the octave compared to the open string. But because it's the long string that's been lengthened by this short amount, this time the amount of adjustment we have to do is only half of what we just had to do, because we're now only half a cent sharp. So let's make another adjustment. Let's move it back 0.019 of a millimetre. We're now in tune on the octave. We play the open string, and the open string's flat again for exactly the same reason, but this time it's only flat by 1/4 of a cent. So we've got to add a little bit more compensation, and this time it's only 0.045 of a millimetre. But can you see what's happening here? If we'd said, let's just say for argument's sake, that the first adjustment we made was 1 millimetre. Then what we've got to do is we're going through a cycle here of ever smaller amounts. The first adjustment's 1 millimetre, the second adjustment is 0.5 millimetre, the next adjustment is 1/4 millimetre, then an 1/8, then a 1/16, then a 32nd, and then a 64th, and we're in this never-ending cycle. But remember our question about what's 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/4 plus an 1/8? Well, it's 2. Instead of adjusting by 1 millimetre at the start of the process, we should have adjusted by 2 millimetres, and then we'd be bang on. We can then just retune the open string and we'll immediately find that the octave is in tune. I hope I haven't lost anybody. But that's why it's twice what we might calculate the adjustment as. So let me reiterate. On a Gibson scale length, it is very slightly different. It's a little bit more on a Fender scale length. If you're 1 cent out at the octave position, you need to move the bridge 0.036 of a millimetre back that way. And it's roughly 1 millimetre for every 3 cents that you're out. Okay? That's the theory. Let's go and see what happens in practice with my Dorso. Not sure how clearly you can see this. Oh, I think you can. If we play the D string, that's pretty accurate. What I'm just going to check though, I'm just going to press the string down onto the saddle, right at the front of the saddle. That seems to have sharpened it somewhat. No, that's fairly accurate. Okay. So we haven't got the string is coming off the front of the saddle. So we're pretty close to being in tune. You'll notice that the frequency falls away as the note dies off. This is because when the string's vibrating with a large amplitude, it's stretching the string a bit and the pitch goes up. I'm sure some of you will have noticed this before, but a heavily plucked string initially is a little bit sharp, and then it starts to decay down to really its true pitch. So we really have to look at what the tuning is as the note is dying away. That is pretty close to being in tune. So now we fret the octave. And we are, that seemed to be about 4 cents. I'd written 3 down on my notes here. I'll change that to 4. So let's look at the next string. So that's fairly well in tune, but let's again just see whether pressing it against the front of the saddle makes any difference. Not really. So let's do the octave. And this time we can see, every time I speak it screws up the tuning. So we're about +5 on that. I had written +9 originally. Let's go +5. Let's do that again. Having to be careful here not to fret too heavily. I'm thinking about +5. So the top 2 strings, the crown needs to be roughly in the middle of the saddle, because that corresponds to about 1.5 millimeters. Let's look at the G string. That's pretty well in tune. Again, let's just check whether pressing it against the saddle makes any difference. No. So let's play the octave. It's about +4. +5. Again, I'm having to fret really gently. +5. And so on. So that was quite tricky to measure really, because I was having... The thing is, when you're fretting at the 12th fret, this is very sensitive to finger pressure. And first of all, you mustn't press too hard anyway, because you'll sharpen the note. And B, you've got to keep that finger pressure consistent. And when you're trying to press a ruler onto the string at the saddle, it's not easy. So this is what I've measured. Now, according to these measurements, we don't need any compensation at all on the A string. But if you remember the problems in the previous video of the sitar-like sound, I think I'd established that the string was vibrating against the back end of the saddle. So I think that's what's going on here. I tried desperately to hold the ruler down against pushing the string down onto the saddle, but it didn't seem to make any difference. So let's ignore that, because let's face it, that's the one anomaly string, the one that doesn't sound right, and it's completely out of line with the strings either side of it. Also note that to the best of my measurement, the B and the G string are the same. So we have a very gentle slope here, just a little bit of compensation needed, extra compensation needed across the strings. But the B and the G are the same. Now, I am tempted to just file straight across the strings and not try to put a step in at the B and the G. I'll put a crown in the middle of the fret here, a little bit towards the back, but then I'll just slope it so that the crown is at the back end of the bridge down here. We'll just put a 45-degree angle across the whole thing. So I've just put some Sharpie on the top of the saddle so I can see what I'm doing, because I don't want to take any off the height. This is almost like a fret crowning, in that I want to make sure that I don't take anything off the height, and I just want to leave the thinnest slither at the back of the bridge there and keep the crown in the middle up here. And it's just occurred to me I didn't make a mark. Maybe I'll just do this smooth all the way. Yeah, I think I will. I'm going to crown it in the middle here and then just taper it back along the length. And what I've got here is I've got 2 blocks of sapele that I've sawn at 45 degrees, and this is going to be my saddle vise. I've actually gone right down to the sapele. Which is actually useful. Just trying to see how much of a crown. Is that 45 degrees? Should be. So now we've got our crown in the middle here and the crown at the back at the far end. And I'm just going to round over the edges so we don't have any sharp bits. A little bit of 400 grit. Beautiful. Nothing too sharp. I was messing with you. I wonder how many of you spat your tea out when I said that this was a 1959 Gibson Les Paul. It's a reissue. If this had been an actual 1959 Gibson Les Paul, it would be worth upwards of £250,000. As it is, it's a very expensive guitar. This is the 59 reissue. But it's sadly not worth £250,000.